Hello, good morning. Welcome to this Efela'S seminar about energy law and COVID-19. It's a great pleasure for me as on behalf of Efela and as the chairman of this federation to welcome you all and to embrace virtually so many friends being present from different parts of and coins of Europe. The first word that I wanted, and first and foremost, to express my gratitude for your presence and do hope that everybody is safe, in good health conditions, and full of great spirit and courage in these difficult times. I'm going to read a brief note of presentation, and then afterwards we will start the seminar with the general introduction that is going to be made by our Secretary General Marinella de Focatiis. Despite the difficulties caused by COVID-19, and thanks to teleworking and our courage, we could keep a close relationship between experts in law and energy regulation during these times. We have promoted different meetings as Efela with sister associations, and particularly with ACIDE, the Latin American Association of Energy Law, exploring some of the legal packages adopted in different nations as a consequence of this exceptional and provisional situation. This crisis has proven again the importance of energy and its infrastructure for the operation of essential services of our societies, such as hospitals, transport, or logistic chain. But we also had to adapt new regulation frameworks to the critical reality of that moment. First, to guarantee the supply of electricity and natural gas, and the universal access of energy, which every citizen has right to, particularly in order to find formulas that allow vulnerable populations to receive the electricity supply in a reliable way, affordable in price and quality for every citizen at every corner. On the other hand, the independent regulator also had to adapt its role and its regulatory powers to this provisional situation. And we must analyze all the regulation published until now and in force, making sure that they do not overflow the time framework they were issued for in an inconvenient or unnecessary manner. The European institutions have recently reaffirmed, and I think is a reason of to congratulate ourselves, their will and commitment to the Green Deal initiative. Climate change and energy policies are fully connected. The governance regulations are common, and the energy rules and regulations will not only have to be compatible with environmental protection, but they must also favor the most adequate systems, resources, financing mechanisms, and technologies for decarbonization. If we look our history, we will remember that in the report named Our Common Future, the Brundtland report, it was highlighted to which extent had energy supply in the adequate conditions been at the core of human progress. That report also emphasized energy is necessary for daily survival. Future development crucially depends on its long-term availability in increasing quantities from sources that are dependable, safe, and environmentally sound. In the late 70s, United States took a series of important reforms in terms of energy, some of them linked to the deregulation of the sector, for which people as Senator Edward Kennedy and Senator John McCain, in a bipartisan way, worked as speakers. Likewise, during the Carter administration, mechanisms for the promotion of energy efficiency and the conservation of energy were started up with new regulations. I remember that the first law in Spain, even though Professor Del Guayo will talk more precisely about the Spanish legislation now, was set up in 1918, for the first time, the conservation law. Thereupon, it appeared in the legal environment with its own entity and with the purpose of promoting energy saving and efficiency, marking the foundations of energy conservation. We can also remember, ironically, that 30 years before, Sir Winston Churchill had given his own definition for energy conservation, stating that it was clearly expressed through individual actions, as he pointed out, Never stand up when you can sit down. Never sit down when you can lay down. Jokes aside, the concern of these subjects, the promotion of energy efficiency, saving measures, the encouragement of clean energies, and the development of renewable energies, despite being a road with many difficulties, has never stopped advancing in the conscience of the international community and in many national legislations. European Union is a community of law, a European law under the primacy of community law. In the leading case, Costa Enel, the court stated that it is impossible for the states to accord precedence to unilateral and subsequent measures over a legal system accepted by them on a basis of reciprocity. In founding terms, the European Union is also a community of energy. 2 to 3 treaties belong to the energy chapter. From now on, the European Union is a union of energy and climate, placing the green objectives, policies, and initiatives in the real core. Today, in the scope of the European Union, energy law is also the Green Deal law, a law that spreads beyond specific technology. It is framed in climate governance, although it's subject to logical sector regulation criteria, such as guarantee of supply, protection of universal access, the retribution of infrastructures, and many other mechanisms and legal entitlements. But it must be a law constructed in the framework of the demands and growing compliance of the decarbonization goals. The new energy law is also a global law, considering it must grant sense and unity dealing with common goals and principles to all of the sources and technologies. Now we have the pleasure to gather in an outstanding group of experts on energy law in Europe, who are part of these energy law national associations belonging to Efela. Other experts will join us, I'm sure, in the next weeks and months, making our federation one important voice in the building up a new sort of packages of energy law and legislation and regulation in Europe, and trying to contribute to this European effort. I want once again to thank you all for your presence, and especially to the former President of the Court of Justice of the European Union, Dr. Jaeger. Already, I would say 3 magistrates from the European High Court are part of our federation, as well as different former commissioners from a National Regulatory Commission. We feel very proud about that. So, and now I will pass the floor to our Secretary General, Marinella di Focatiis. Thanks to her, we have been able to prepare this seminar with many contributors and a large number of experts. Thank you very much to you all.
So, good morning, everyone. And I have the role of a speaker, and I prepared a general brief introduction. Having gathered information from different sources about the impact the COVID-19 pandemic has had on the energy market at the European level, I would like to focus on 4 points that can guide the debate of Efela'S 13 countries. Firstly, energy demand. Secondly, energy prices. Thirdly, renewables. And finally, end consumers. How big was the impact of COVID-19 on the energy demand? As we all know, the measures taken against the COVID-19 pandemic had a strong impact on the energy demand in the electricity, oil, and gas sector. The recent coronavirus outbreak and the lockdown measures adopted by several European countries brought many commercial and industrial activities to a halt. The power sector was significantly affected by this outbreak, with changes seen in both supply and demand. Electricity demand has been significantly reduced as a result of lockdown measures, with knock-on effects on the power mix. Electricity demand has been depressed by 20% or more during periods of full lockdown in several countries, as increases for residential demand are far outweighed by big reductions in commercial and industrial operations. For weeks, the shape of the band resembled that of a prolonged Sunday. Demand reductions have left the share of renewables in the electricity supply, as their output is largely unaffected by demand. Demand fell for all other sources of electricity, including coal, gas, and nuclear power. Italy, my country, for example, recorded a reduction by as much as 25% in the expected electricity demand since it implemented a strict lockdown, having closed all business and industrial activities except for the activities considered essential. The first case of coronavirus was registered in Italy on the 20th of February, and as a consequence, it was the country that first decreed the mandatory confinement of the population, and together with Spain, decreed one of the strictest confinements. In Italy, the electricity demand decreased week by week, starting from the 9th of March. As of the 14th of March, restrictive measures led to a further power demand reduction, reaching its lowest levels in the last 15 years. And what about the prices? The price of electricity decreased in Europe, reaching its lowest level in the last decade. The low gas prices, together with a certain influence of the fall in demand, are mainly responsible for the current low prices in the electricity markets. The behavior of the last month was analogous to that observed in the gas market prices, with a continuous decline since the heights of September 2018. This fall in the wholesale prices has also had significant effects on energy prices for consumers, even though with a delay of a few months. The prices of the TTF European gas market, which had already started going in 2019, also hit the lowest level in the last 15 years. Even the price of a Brent oil barrel fell to its lowest level in the last 15, dropping from $60 to close to $20 per barrel. Thirdly, renewables. What was the role of renewables in this period, and what will be their role in the future? What's very interesting is that despite the fact that energy demand in Europe dropped by 3.8% in the first quarter of the year compared with the first quarter of 2019, according to the International Energy Agency, renewable energy demand increased by 1.5%, and this was largely driven by the additional wind and solar projects that came online over the past year and the priority given to renewables in most power sectors. However, total renewable generation has remained at pre-crisis levels with low electricity prices, combined with renewable-friendly policy measures squeezing out fossil fuel power generation, especially coal. Does this set the scene for the next decade of the energy transition? Wind and solar power accounted for 23% of electricity production in the European 27 countries and UK during this period. And finally, will the pool of poor energy users be enlarged after coronavirus? As we all know, almost 50 million people are affected by energy poverty in Europe, around 10% of the population. Exceptional measures of various kinds have been implemented in several European countries due to COVID-19. In Europe, various emergency policies have been implemented by governments and regulatory authorities to meet the immediate needs related to access to energy. These include, in my country and in France, suspension of disconnection in the supply due to non-payments. In Spain, moratoriums for paying bills in families where a member has lost their job. In UK or Ireland, flexible payment plans to address liquidity problems. But what will happen when these are revoked? The crisis will continue and the number of people in need is likely to grow considerably. Is it the right time to establish a right to energy? There are several debates in Europe. And what about the end customers and the problem of consumer protection? Before the coronavirus pandemic, the protection was limited to vulnerable customers, and it was a protection limited to particularly disadvantaged categories. While after the COVID-19, the interventions implemented were aimed at protecting all the consumers. For example, in Italy, a decree has established that the emergency excludes liability for late payments. And now we will listen to how Efela'S 13 countries coped with the coronavirus pandemic. And I give the floor to our moderator, Raphael Heffron.
Thank you, Marinella, for that very clear introduction about some of the effects of the coronavirus on the energy sector. And just to say that, thank you very much to all those in attendance, and thank you to all the speakers that we're going to hear from this morning and in the afternoon. And just to remember that this event is being recorded and it will go on YouTube later. So do keep that in mind as you're going through your presentation. A second thing to say is do keep some of the questions coming in. We've had one or two already, and what we will aim for is to have a couple of questions after we hear from 3 speakers. But also we have it confirmed that the questions that are asked will also be answered and will be available on the Efela website after the event, answered by the respective national energy law associations. So my name is Raphael Heffron. I'm representing the UK, despite my beautiful Irish accent. I'm based over in the University of Dundee, and I will be the moderator for today. And let's say it's just a small coincidence that the very first speaker is from my university, Professor Peter Cameron, who's co-chair of the UK Energy Law and Policy Association. And many of you will know him already as one of the most respected book authors in Europe and internationally on energy law. So I hand over to you, Peter.
Thank you, Raphael. And I hope that everyone will appreciate my beautiful Irish accent. That was a joke. Well, I'm of course from Scotland, so there's you're getting a sense of the various nations that make up the United Kingdom and the other different nation that's not too far away on the island of Ireland. UK, United Kingdom. Marinella and Vicente asked me to talk about the various measures that have been taken inside the UK So I'm going to try and keep this fairly concise, because I know that many other people want to talk about their national regime, national responses. I don't have too much to say that has an EU angle to it, I'm afraid. It's quite national in its focus, so I hope you'll bear with me, and I will try and be very brief. I'm afraid that my slides are not yet available, but Marinella will upload them a little bit later and share them with you. First of all, the United Kingdom, let me say a little bit about the form of its response, the legal form to the COVID-19 virus impact. Basically, it introduced a law, a statute, like many other countries, I think more than 100 countries around the world, it introduced special legislation, emergency powers. However, a key point is that nothing in that legislation was expressly directed at the energy sector. It didn't have a section inside it that could be said to be a sort of addition to existing energy law. Why? The answer is very simple. Emergency powers already existed. And also, like a number of countries, the United Kingdom has got a sort of bedrock of informal arrangements that it has between, say, the regulator and the industry, or the regulator and the customers, so that it could fall back on a whole series of legal arrangements that were, as it were, underneath the statute level or based on existing other statutes. So that's the first point about the style of lawmaking to deal with the virus. Secondly, with respect to the energy sector, the regulator was very keen to emphasize that the priority lay with, first of all, vulnerable customers. This is why you can probably understand there already was legislation to deal with them, but it was a question of prioritizing. Vulnerable customers are what we need to look after in this situation. And secondly, critical workers. Which workers are critical for us to keep the economy going at this time? So that category of worker was identified as important to be safeguarded, and that included energy workers. In the United Kingdom's case, that meant oil and gas workers, electricity workers, anybody involved in the renewable sector, for example. And then a third area of importance was, again, it won't surprise you, corporate resilience. How can we make sure that companies do not fail at this point in time? What we don't want is an electricity utility to suddenly find that it's going to collapse and it files for administration. So those were the three priorities that quickly emerged: looking after vulnerable customers, disabled, sick people, and so on, critical workers, corporate resilience. Now, how would this existing regulatory regime be enforced? If you happen to be a worker or a company, a corporate executive, a manager, that would be your question. What is the relationship going to be with the regulator at the moment? Is the regulator going to be sensitive to the problems that we're having at the moment, or are they going to take a hard line and monitor the performance conditions we've got in our licenses? So there had to be assurance by the regulatory authorities that basically, I hope you can hear me all right. There had to be assurance by the regulatory authorities that there would be flexibility in the enforcement. This was done in the form of giving advice to investors, advice to the sectors, to the, like retail networks and so on. Informal advice was given to them to keep calm. Would the standards of performance still apply? Yes. So there's a bit of a balance. We can be flexible, but the standards of performance that you have signed up to are ones that will not vary. Industry codes, they were reviewed and modifications took place with respect to the codes. Again, you get to the operational level below the statute. Very, very important to make sure that that was functioning. Moving on, contracts. What happened about contracts? What were the issues there? Nothing terribly novel to tell you about there. Two issues. One, contract terms would be enforced. Energy contract terms would be enforced as they were supposed to be enforced, subject to force majeure provisions. And if something unexpected went wrong, or maybe there was some introduction of a law, a regulatory measure that disrupted the contract, then that would be addressed by a change in law provision inside the contract. That was the assumption. So those are the two legal ideas: force majeure, and secondly, change in law. There were national planning arrangements in place. Again, guidance, very sub-legal or quasi-legal type of advice. Let's move on to two remaining points. One is response. What was the response of the regulator? Very active, very reassuring, but not lawmaking, just making guidance notes and issuing those to specific parts of the sector. Very active. That regulator was Ofgem for the electricity and gas sector, and for the upstream sector, because we produce oil and gas in the UK, there was a regulator for the exploration and production side, and they also produced a guidance for the industry. However, what we should keep in mind is that it's not just a matter of law. It's also a matter of markets. And what we have seen is that many of these companies have simply laid off workers on a very large scale, and that's not the result, not the direct result of the COVID virus, but it's an indirect result that's enormously important. And I should say that the Scottish government, which is a devolved part of the UK system, has introduced a special, what they call energy transition fund. It's a fairly modest amount of money, 62 million. In energy terms, that's small, but the idea is good. It's good that the government is seeing, hey, we've got a problem, we've got a challenge here, because on the one hand we have a problem, on the other hand we have an opportunity to try and maybe accelerate the energy transition in the UK away from oil and gas to fossil fuels towards hopefully renewable energy and low carbon intensive forms of energy. So they took that initiative. I think that's probably, Raphael, I'm using up all of my time. So I think those are quite specific points. I've deliberately kept within a box here, rather than going up to the big macro level. I can rely on all these talented contributors to do that. So I think I'm just going to stop with that short overview of the United Kingdom. Thank you, Raphael.
Thank you, and thank you for a very clear and direct talk about what is happening in terms of the UK at the moment. So we will go straight over to Serbia, and one of the newer members of Efela, and Branislava is going to speak about what's happening in Serbia. Over to you.
Thank you, Raphael. Good morning, ladies and gentlemen, dear colleagues. Thank you, and I am honored to have a possibility to speak in Efela'S seminar about Serbian energy law, even if this is in pandemic COVID-19 situation. I hope that you can see my screen, or I have to share it again.
Yeah, we can see it. Thank you.
Okay. What was happening in Serbia during this pandemic COVID-19 situation? There are consequences of pandemic in the Serbian energy sector, and I will speak about current situation and expectations. Okay. And what was happened? Firstly, it was restructuring in energy demand. There was no major drop in electricity demand side. Residential demand dominated demand portfolio. Majority of industrial demand is from large process industries that continue working. We have in mind that electrical utility is state-owned. And at the same time, expectations was that we had to restructuring economy in this situation. And also, at the same time, there were no energy regulatory response so far, and expectation is changes in energy framework, which can happen. And also, there were no price response, and the expectation is that energy parity can increase. And operators working in crisis regime, and expectation is that increase the attention to energy security. And having in mind both of points, that we can have a problem of security increase. Beyond that, impacts of pandemic COVID-19 are not the only adverse impacts. Climate change effects to economy and to the people is still present. And there were unstable weather conditions with frequent and rapid variation. There were drought, which influenced the agricultural sector and food resource. Also, we had floods with high level of damages in agricultural sector and infrastructure. And there were no relevant preventive activities in regulatory framework yet. And finally, what we have at the end, problem again of security supply increase. And furthermore, what is situation in the region? Significant evolution in the regional strategic landscape during pandemic is that Croatia LNG terminal capacity blocked. Turk Stream gas pipeline through Serbia receives regulatory approval. Hungary MOL joins Turk Stream project. EU announces Green Deal, ramping up pressure of lignite coal-fired power plants. And finally, Kosovo TSO accession into NCOE and formation of the Kosovo-Albania regulatory bloc. Actually, problem of security of supply reconfigured. And also, there is one fact which we have to in our minds. During pandemic of COVID-19 was a lot of research, and there is concluded that interdependence between pandemic COVID-19 and air pollution is present, And you can see figures in table and in the map. And in the map, you can see the most polluted areas in Europe and in Serbia, which was also mostly with COVID-19's effects. And this link with COVID-19 mortality to citizens is closely linked with long-term exposure to polluted air, and it significantly increased by COVID-19. In Serbia,
Laura, continua a ascoltare la linea, io non sento più niente. Hanno fatto anche una domanda a me. Cosa devo fare?
In Serbia, during the pandemic of COVID-19, even the traffic decrease, air pollution was staying at the same level as it was before. And finally, what the pandemic brought to us. It brought to us uncertainty in energy law and guesstimate in the energy sector. But firstly, it brought to us uncertainty in daily life increased, while daily activities seem simplified by this Meyer effect. It looks like strange, but I feel. And also what the pandemic brought to us, it brought weaknesses in efficiency of response with relevant strategy adjustment and regulatory framework. And what we can expect in future, what action is needed. There is a need for rapid, short-term price and regulatory adjustments to control risk toward forthcoming winter. And what we can, as lawyers, as members of Energy Association, we have a knowledge and experience in our Energy Law Association, supported by our federation, Efela'S, and we may support both crisis response and post-crisis recovery. Thank you.
Thank you, and a very clear presentation identifying a lot of uncertainties there in Serbia. So next up we have Spain, and we have Íñigo, who is a co-editor of a very recent book on energy justice, which is well worth a read, but seems to be definitely a theme in terms of some of the talks so far in identifying vulnerable customers. But I'll hand straight over to Íñigo.
Thank you very much, Raphael. I wonder whether you are now watching to my presentation or not. Do you see the slides?
We do, yeah.
But it's funny that you see the slides, but I don't see my own slides anywhere in the screen. So I don't know where we are. Do you think you can move the slides forward, Raphael, or should I do it? Now, here we go. I will do it on my own. So I am encouraged by the words of Professor Cameron, that he said that we are a group of talented people, and that make me a lot of strength for my presentation. Thank you, Peter. And I found both the presentation of Peter and Branislava to be of great interest. And I want to very briefly explain to you how the Spanish jurisdiction cope with the coronavirus in the energy sector. When the coronavirus erupted in my country, I was already drafting an article which is going to be published in a few weeks about principles of energy law. And I must confess that I was doing that. I was drafting that article because of Vicente, our president, pushing us to be involved in a project led by Raphael Heffron about the creation of a series of energy law principles. So it's very nice to be today with both Vicente and Raphael in the same webinar, because it was thank you to Raphael Heffron article about the treatise for energy law and the strength of Vicente that I was doing that. And when the coronavirus erupted, I thought this is the end of everything. This is the end of the principles we have been thinking about for so many decades now. But my conclusion is that far from being away from those principles, I think the virus, the crisis, has strengthened those three principles. In my view, those guiding principles, and I use the word guiding in the same sense that Professor Heffron does in his article, the three main guiding principles are security of supply, economic efficiency, and environmental sustainability. Even the principle of resilience is, in my view, included in the security of supply. When COVID started, we experienced in our jurisdiction, and I think that in every single EU member state, we experienced a maximization of security of supply. The pandemic exacerbated the need to guarantee security of supply at the expense of economic efficiency and sustainability. So governments were focused on guaranteeing that the energy sector was properly functioning and guaranteeing that vulnerable consumers, people who had lost their jobs, will have energy supply. The royal decree which introduced in my country the alarm status, the royal decree number 463/2020, said that the government, the authority, was empowered to introduce any needed measure to guarantee natural gas supply, electricity supply, and oil product supply, using the extraordinary powers already given by the Electricity and the Hydrocarbons Act. So in this sense, my conclusion is the same one that Peter Cameron. There was no particular legislation needed to guarantee the functioning of the sector, but remembering that the powers were already in those two acts. Energy services were considered to be essential services, something which is quite close, but not the same thing that a public service. Here in the continent, as opposed to the UK and Ireland, we find a proper sense to the word public service, and also some measures to critical infrastructure. Initially, Royal Decree Law number 8/2020 took some measures to guarantee that vulnerable consumers will receive energy supply. And there were a number of very reasonable, sensible measures adopted in that Royal Decree Law. However, in Royal Decree Law number 11/2020, further measures were introduced at the expense of economic efficiency. And this is my main conclusion. The main conclusion is that the government in this Royal Decree 11/2020 went too further, because it extended the protection so much and it allowed contracts to be changed. at the request of consumers, industrials and small consumers, at the expense of companies, putting upon companies a too big burden. And so I think that whereas Royal Decree Law 8/2020 was sensible, Royal 11/2020 went in maximizing security of supply at the expense of economic efficiency. And my last slide wants to underline that coronavirus cannot be an excuse to stop decarbonization, but rather coronavirus must be an impetus to decarbonization. And I'm happy to remember the audience that 2 days ago, 7 coal power plants were closed in Spain. So there are only 4 coal power plants working, which are waiting for the permission of the government to close. So this is a good signal that even though the virus, we are still on the track of decarbonization. Thank you very much for the invitation to Vicente, to Efela, to Marinella. And at 12 o'clock, I will say goodbye to you all because it is the closing ceremony of the Master on Energy Law, to which I am the director, so I will not be able to be with you more than 12 o'clock. Thank you.
Thank you. And I think we have, there is some positive news there from Spain in terms of the coal plant closures, in terms of the low carbon energy transition. But I think we have time for a quick question. And I address this maybe to all the panelists. And so beginning with Peter first, moving to Branislava, then Íñigo. So if you could keep your answers very short and very brief. But how is your country going to tackle the potential of a security of supply issue as we move forward in terms of the low carbon energy transition, but also the pandemic, and we think of the potential impact on supplies, in particular that Branislava mentioned. So just beginning with you first, Peter. Yeah, it's yeah, working there.
I heard somebody off camera was said unmuted or something. Okay, I think with respect to the UK, the organisation of the system is a very tight system. There's not much flexibility that is possible, in the sense that it's a system that has been built to serve its purpose. It serves the purpose, but the moment you start trying to change it, and inevitably with an energy transition, there are going to be changes, some of which you can't predict, unintended consequences and so on. That the tightness in that system could become a problem. So, the limited gas storage, for example, an electricity network that's designed to meet a specific set of customers. So spikes in that and changes in the pattern of electricity demand become a little bit problematic. So I think that's the one thing, that the system has not been, as it were, rationally designed with a view to an energy transition. So that's a red light there. And I think probably the second point would be that UK is lucky in having quite a lot of indigenous resources. We've thought a lot about security of supply in the past. So I don't think that there's a I don't think that in terms of the planning, not the same as capacity, that there's likely to be a problem. I think that's probably all I have to say on that, Raphael.
Thank you, and over to you, Branislava.
Thank you, Raphael. Yes, absolutely, it is necessity of energy law transition, having in mind this COVID-19 effects. And regarding Serbia, there is some additionally. Serbia does not have direct access to seaborne energy markets. It is a small landlocked country with accumulation of risks and uncertainties, as I said in presentation. Therefore, any regional integration and integration into wider European market is not only beneficial, but for us urgent necessity. Thank you.
Thank you. And to you, Íñigo.
So thank you. The question, if I understood properly, is how to combine security supply and decarbonization in my country.
Yeah.
Okay. From that point of view, the closing of coal power plants will mean an increase of the relevance for security supply of natural gas power plants, the combined cycles. So it will be an opportunity for natural gas to reinforce its role of a backup of the renewable system. The Spanish government has clearly opted for renewables, and in that context, we need to have a firm capacity of natural gas. There is no other option, because the government is also against nuclear power plants. We have 7 reactors, but the life of those reactors is not going to be extended with the new government. So, and if coal power plants are going to be closed, and the connection of the peninsula, of the Iberian Peninsula, with France and the rest of the EU is so limited, we don't have too many options to give security to the system, but giving a reinforced role to natural gas production.
Thank you. So some good points there, and I would just mention, those issues that were mentioned by all 3 speakers, system integration, and particularly the issue of flexibility, are key issues, and definitely in the research literature, flexibility is an issue that is on the rise. So moving on to the next 3 speakers, we have 2 speakers from Portugal representing 2 of the biggest energy law practices there, and both are on the board. So I think it's Vanda first to speak.
Yes, good morning, everybody. First of all, I would like to thank Efela'S for the invitation for UPDEN, the Portuguese Energy Law Association, to participate in this webinar, and for inviting me as well. So thank you very much. I truly believe that it's very important for all of us to share experience at national level, and we will all certainly benefit from this sharing of experience. UPDEN presentation is split between Ivone and myself. I will address mainly the main measures that were taken by the Portuguese government during the state of emergency period, and Ivone will take care of the what has been the government doing in parallel other than emergency measures, because there has been a lot being done, including among some measures the launching of a solar auction for renewables, of course. So regarding the main measures taken by the Portuguese state during the state of emergency, I thought it was first useful to just briefly refer to the various meanings of the states that were considering Portugal, because they may not mean the same for all European countries. So the highest level of protection, let's say, of change was the state of emergency. Then below that, the state of calamity, and below that, the situation of alert and situation of contingency. So the state of emergency started on March 19. You have there in small letters the reference to the diplomas, which of course, though they are important, I think for the presentation, we'll skip that. And this state of emergency may only be declared if a public disaster occurs or a threat of a public disaster. It's a more cumbersome and complex procedure. So after hearing the government and obtaining the parliament's authorization, the president of the republic may declare a state of emergency, which allows ordering the partial suspension of citizens' rights, freedoms, and guarantees. So you see several references to the Constitution below. This state of emergency was renewed twice and extended until May 2. And from then on, the state of calamity became effective. This state of calamity is still effective regarding several municipalities in the region of Great Lisbon, but the rest of the country, as from yesterday, entered a situation of alert or contingency. But as I will not be able to go through all the measures taken, I will focus on the main important or restrictive ones during this pandemic period, which were the ones for the state of emergency, and from some references to what went beyond that. So the state of calamity, as you see, may be declared when there is an occurrence or a risk of a serious accident or catastrophe, and taking into account its intensity, it may be deemed necessary to adopt measures to prevent, react, or restore normal living conditions in some areas affected by its effects. That's why, as I told you before, the state of calamity is still ongoing in some regions of the Great Lisbon. So, pursuant to the declaration of state emergency, so next slide, please, an order was issued by the Minister for the Environment and Climate Action, and this order set the conditions for the operation of some essential goods and services, not only energy, for instance, waste and water. And so a bit like Íñigo was saying, we have also a difference between public service, and this were the essential service that the Portuguese government wanted to take care of during the state of pandemic and the state of emergency. And this wanted to safeguard the supply chains of, among others, as I told you, electricity and natural gas, supply of liquid fuel, and liquefied petroleum gas. And this entered into force and became effective at midnight on March 23, with being immediately enforceable. And it sought to maintain during the state of emergency that provision of electricity, gas, liquid fuel, and LPG was maintained undisrupted and stable and continuous. And the measures wanted to ensure that certain number of service and the infrastructure would be ensured by the relevant entities, and foreseeing that specific teams would be designated for the continuous operation and maintenance of the infrastructures, as well as for securing response to urgent situations and remote customer services, including in case of breakdowns and incidents. So there was a concern from the Portuguese state that there would be no issues with the continuity of supply and the security of supply, in the same line as the previous speakers were saying, with the principle of security of supply underlining all of this. So next slide, please. So as regards the entities subject to assign specific teams to ensure the continuous provisions, we had the managing entities and concessionaires for the natural gas distribution, the managing entities for electricity transmission, entities managing natural gas transmission and storage and service related to LPG terminals, distribution systems operators, municipalities, and concessionaires for low voltage electricity distribution. So main stakeholders of the system in relation to the operation and assuring the continuous supply. And this was done in a way that it was clearly said in the order that this was regardless of the nature of such entities, of the nature of the concession agreements, and of the applicable licenses. So it was really clear that everybody had to contribute to the effort. And this also, it was made clear that it was without prejudice to the other directives, recommendations, and regulations issued by the relevant entities, and of course the regulation and supervision responsibilities of the energy services regulators. But the order also had an impact on relationship of the entities with third parties. And for instance, it was made clear that relevant entities had to keep in force and in effect contracts and agreements, namely supply and services agreements entered into with third parties as required and necessary for the fulfillment of their obligations. So in order, again, to ensure security of supply, it was meant. Next slide, please. But other regulations and other exception provisions were also considered and were also enforced during the state of emergency. And unfortunately, I will not have time to go through all measures, so I will just mention a few measures. And those measures focused mainly on COVID-19 issues specifically related, commercial relations with consumers, domestic consumers with low voltage, and in relation or low pressure if concerning gas, and in relation to licensing procedures before the Energy Directorate. So as relating to domestic customers, similar to Spain, in effect, there was a prohibition of interruption and suspension of supply, and this was up to the month, to the end of the month subsequent to the end of state of emergency, so until June 2. Subsequently, this was extended until 30 September 2020 in relation to consumers either unemployed with reduction in income equal or higher than 20% or that were infected with COVID-19. There are, of course, criteria, I mean, evidence that needs to be shown. There are specific rules on payment plans and so on. Unfortunately, I don't have the time to go through it, but just for you to have a feeling that all this was taken care of. In terms of specific COVID-19 issues, I will highlight that there were also regulations that grid operators should prioritize the supply to priority facilities. So hospitals, healthcare facilities exceptionally mobilized for such effect. And this was, of course, it's key that this is taken care of during these difficult times. There was also some changes to electricity and gas price in relation to some of the tariffs, including, for instance, the social tariff. And in terms of deadlines for procedures and for formalities before the Energy Directorate, including in the context of tender procedure, those were temporarily suspended since the moment the Energy Directorate closed the doors to the public. And also there was a temporary suspension of new requests for attribution of titles and agreements for attribution of injection capacity, registration of small-scale generation units, or self-consumption generation units, production license, and establishment license for grid infrastructure. Of course, this was not like radical. There were some exceptions, for instance, in case of urgencies. So there was also this caution of establishing the required exceptions. I could continue to say much more about measures taken care during this pandemic period. I wanted to show mainly that there was a big concern from the Portuguese government during this period to address several specific issues and to ensure the continuous supply and also the protection of the most vulnerable. And also to highlight that there was, other than energy, an intensive legislative activity during this period. And even just focusing on the energy sector, you can see that that was the case. But while this was taking place, other important steps for the future of the Portuguese energy sector, and also for coping and for helping to progress with the Green Deal were being put in place by the Portuguese government. And Ivone will go through those, and I will so leave now the floor to Ivone. And I would like to thank you all for your kind attention.
Thank you. Thank you to Efela for the organization and for the invitation for this conference. It is very important to share from experience from different countries, especially in this moment, an uncertain moment. Everybody talks about the need to construction, the new normal, but the truth is that we should understand better it and what's going on in order to prepare better the future. Concerning energy, we should ask what kind of consumers and what kind of production should do part of this new normal. My colleague Vanda just spoke about the emergency period and the emergency measures adopted by the Portuguese government in a similar way, as she said, for the energy sector. But this period was followed by the phase that are currently going through, the stabilization phase, with the upcoming phase of economic recovery in preparation. So it will be up to me to speak of these two last phases and try to explain what's going on in Portugal. Portugal, like other European Union countries, approved its national energy and climate plan, setting renewables targets for 2030. And one of the consequences brought by COVID, in addition to its impact on health and health systems, was the economic crisis. Being energy a simultaneous factor of productions and a capital-intensive economic activity, it has suffered a double shock, as Marinella showed in her slides. With the shutting of some industries and the reduction of activity in others, the demand of energy suffered a sharp decline. And this decline was not offset, however, by the increase in domestic consumption resulting from the confinement. In turn, like any other sector, the measures of social distance also affect the construction, the operation, the maintenance, and the development of energy infrastructures. All of this, along with the sudden drop in oil prices, has caused some critics to question the speed of the energy transition. So I will ask for the second slide, please. This was not the option adopted by the Portuguese government, neither from the European Union. We are going on with the Green Deal, and I think that I expect that we could say nor by the world. To the contract concerning the Portuguese government, during the state of emergency, the Portuguese government prepared and published important status and implemented measures in order to maintain the goals for the decarbonization of the economy. With special impact on energy, and I should ask for the third slide, please. The government published and adopted, taking in consideration the vulnerable customers, as Peter talked about, he put in the economic recovery plan published a few weeks ago, where energy efficiency in building and action against energy poverty will be granted support by the reinforcing of the environmental fund. All the regulations for the decentralized energy production and for the constitution of the energy communities were published, and also a great reduction of the grid use causes for this kind of projects. The implementation of digital and simplified license procedures for energy production, special for the grid capacity costs agreement with the operator. We are currently underway the open public discussion for the national hydrogen strategy, important for the security of the supply and to the decarbonization of transport and some industrial, special the intensive energy ones. And finally, the maintenance of the proposal of the organization of the annual auction by the launching of a new one in order to allocation energy production capacity from renewable source with the combination with storage. And this is the first time that happened in Portugal. And this was very curious because the presentation was made during the state emergency by webinar regarding the general terms and potential schedule for this tender. And about 40 days later, the conditions and bidding terms were introduced throughout a new online presentation, and although with longer deadlines than the previous one, this tender procedure is currently underway. And we should say that this is a really new normal action. 700 megawatts of capacity will be distributed across the south of Portugal, whose allocation combines three kinds of remuneration: the guaranteed remuneration, market price with fixed contribution, or storage remuneration. The procedures, and I ask to slide 4, please. The procedure will be all done by platform, so we don't need any contact or displacement. Of course, this can more difficult in order to find the lands and so on, but it comprises 3 phases. The first one, which is going on, is the qualification, which is done on the candidature website with the presentation of the initial purchase bids, quantities that we want to offer, and the remuneration that we will choose, and the presentation of the legal documents with a bank guarantee of 10,000 euros for megawatt offer. This phase is going on, and it will end at the end of this month. Then we will have the second phase with the electronic bidding, which is executed on OMIP bidding platform. And finally, the awarding, giving the ejection rights to the winners. The next slide, please. As Peter said, it is not just a matter of law, but as Vicente said, energy is necessary for all, and it's a global issue that should take care of it. So the energy new normal must be a combination and a balance between behaviors: the government's behaviors, the pandemic behavior, the European behavior, and the market behavior. We don't know how the market will answer. We don't know how the pandemic will answer. We will see it in the next months, but I think it is very important to maintain the energy transition in the new normal. Thank you.
Thank you. and thank you for a very comprehensive presentation from Portugal. So going straight over to Nicole Ridge from Arthur Cox, one of the leading law firms and energy law firms in Ireland. So over to you, Nicole.
So, thank you, Raphael, and hello to everyone. Thank you very much for having me today. I'm going to give a very brief overview of what's been happening in the energy sector in Ireland over the last few months. So I think at the outset, one of the most striking things about the reaction to the COVID-19 crisis in Ireland and the measures that were introduced to protect the country was that this was a particularly challenging and an interesting time for Ireland in any event. We had a general election here in early February without a decisive outcome. So Ireland had a caretaker government in charge over the last few months. And they had to react quite swiftly to events as they unfolded, pushing through the vast amounts of legislation and powers required to address the crisis. And in parallel, political parties involved were trying to navigate coalition discussions in order to form an enduring government at a time when the country most needed one. So one of the most positive outcomes over the last few months is that as of last week, we have a new government, a coalition which includes the Green Party, and a new programme for government with a very strong focus on climate change and the economic opportunities that will flow from that. So I'll come back to that briefly at the end. So in terms of the public health measures that were introduced at the end of March, very similar to across Europe, the government announced general restrictions on movement in the interests of protecting public health. Only employees who were essential to the provision of essential services and could not otherwise work from home were permitted to travel to work. So what this meant for the energy and utility sector, essential services included power generation, transmission and distribution of electricity and gas, and maintenance and construction of critical utility infrastructure. So while COVID-19, of course, had an impact on operation and development of energy projects, the steps were taken to ensure that there was an uninterrupted supply of electricity, gas, and essential energy services. And overall, I think we can say the energy sector in Ireland has proven quite resilient and coped quite well. In terms of the specific measures that had an impact on the energy sector, to protect domestic customers, the regulator introduced a temporary moratorium on disconnections for non-payment and increased the emergency credit for gas customers that use prepayment meters. The regulator also introduced a temporary supply suspension scheme to assist small and medium businesses. So if a business had been classed as non-essential and was closed as a result of the crisis, fixed network charges would be suspended for business premises for the duration of the restrictions. And this scheme has been broadly implemented by suppliers. In planning, the government announced a freeze on timelines in the planning code so that the initial crisis period from the 29th of March to the 23rd of May would be disregarded when calculating deadlines for lodging applications, appeals, or judicial review proceedings in relation to planning. So that will have had an impact on the timetables for projects in the early stages of development. In the renewable sector, the timeline for the first auction for the Renewable Energy Support Scheme, the new subsidy scheme, was slightly pushed back in recognition of the restrictions on participants, but is still very much on track to proceed later this year. So moving on to the ongoing impact in the energy sector. Again, I think similar to what we've heard from other presenters, the overall demand has decreased compared to the same period last year, and that in turn has contributed, at least in part, to a fall in electricity prices. Although I should say there's been a very high level of wind generation on the grid as well, which would have played a part. For energy projects under construction or maintenance of operational projects, developers and contractors will be required to comply with with a whole lot of new workplace measures and standard operating procedures. The Health and Safety Authority has been tasked with monitoring compliance with all of those, and has recruited hundreds of new inspectors to help with that. So it's fair to say there's a particular focus on the construction sector and how it will cope with the crisis going forward. Ensuring compliance to those requirements will have a significant and practical impact on costs and programs for works. So, for example, the cost of additional personnel and just managing the number of workers that can be on site at any one time. One of the main areas of focus for contracts and negotiating contracts going forward will be who will be responsible for carrying the costs associated with those measures, how price adjustments will work, and extensions of time will be managed, management of supply chain issues, and the different compensation remedies that will be available for parties. But I think it's important to say that in spite of all of those challenges and some delays, energy projects are still very much going forward and reaching financial close, which is really encouraging for the sector as a whole. So, looking forward, the emergency restrictions are being gradually lifted here in Ireland. I mentioned this new programme for government, which sets out a roadmap for economic recovery, which is very much been put forward as a green recovery. There's a real recognition by the new government of how critical the next 10 years are going to be to address the climate crisis. So just to give an idea of some of the headline points, they've committed up to an average 7% per annum reduction in overall greenhouse gas emissions from 2021 to 2030, and to achieving net zero emissions by 2050. And that 2050 target will be put on a statutory basis through a climate action bill to be introduced within the first 100 days of the new government. The aim is to develop a stronger national energy and climate plan for 2030 and implement a new national energy and efficiency action plan to reduce energy use. There's a real emphasis on renewables and on offshore renewables, and the new programme specifically mentions a first option for offshore wind, which is planned for next year. The carbon tax is set to increase to €100 per tonne by 2030. Those revenues are to ring-fence to fund a national retrofitting programme, initiatives to address fuel poverty, and fund greener and more sustainable farming. I could go on, there's a lot in the programme, but I think the main takeaway that I think similar to Portugal, the COVID-19 crisis appears to have accelerated the green agenda in Ireland and how we tackle climate change. So it will be very interesting to see how that plays out over the next few months and years. So I will wrap up there. I hope it's given you a useful snapshot of what's happening in Ireland at the moment. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Nicole, and some good positive news there in terms of the low carbon transformation plans in Ireland that are planned. So going over straight to Panos from Greece, who is also as a lawyer, but is also an advisor to the Minister for Energy. So perhaps some of what he learns today will feed directly into Greek energy policy in the future. So over to you, Panos.
I'd like to say this webinar with distinguished colleagues, and I will try, although it's the last presentation for this session, to give you a quick and clean view on what's going on in Greece. Do you see my presentation already?
Yeah, we can see that.
Perfect. So the outline, we will cover the introduction, the general measures applicable to various sectors, not only energy, then the legal nature of the measures, then the measures specific to the energy sector, and finally we will be evaluating those measures. As an introduction, Greece took a wide array of measures, some were to protect the spreading of the disease against COVID. The others were to support the national economy. Going in the second bullet, we see 4 categories: taxation, social security, administration, and facilitation of business and support of their sustainability. How Peter Cameron put it, corporate resilience. Regarding the eligibility, as a general principle, no specific actions were required by the companies to become eligible, except for the fact that for specific taxation and social security measures, there is a list of activity code numbers published by the Ministry of Finance. Seeing the 4 categories again, we will be going a bit quicker by just focusing on the measures that are general but apply also to energy. So these are the green measures with green letters. So taxation measures, there was a reduced VAT rate to 6% when purchasing COVID-protected products. Furthermore, there was an acceleration of refunds from the state of income tax and VAT for amounts below 30,000 euro per tax type and taxpayer. Turning to social security measures, there was a suspension possibility for the private sector of employment with a special compensation of 800 euros payable to the employee. Now, the social security contributions of the employee would be covered by the state. Regarding administrative measures, there were 3 types of extensions. These related to public procurement deadlines, contractual duration, procedural and judicial deadlines. Furthermore, there were deferrals of planned public tenders. Turning to the final type of general measures, which were the corporate resilience measures, there was the creation of the state guarantee fund to support loans, which are guaranteed by 80% from the Greek state. And there was an option for businesses to operate with intermittent employment of available staff due to safety and health reasons. Finally, there was a suspension of deadlines for the submission and payment of bank checks and other financial instruments. This was for 75 days. Now, but what was the legal nature of those measures? This was an exceptional legislative procedure. It is called Act of Legislative Content, and it is based in the Greek Constitution. Under extraordinary circumstances of an urgent and unforeseeable need, the Council of Ministers may decide to take such measures, and this is not subject to scrutiny by the courts. These measures can last up to 40 days and then have to be ratified by law to continue being in operation and valid. Seeing the legislative procedure, we see the 3 steps. There is a proposal submitted by the Council of Ministers to the President of the Hellenic Republic. Then the act is issued in the official gazette. And then within 40 days, it has to be ratified by law to remain at force. We will be exploring now the measures specific only to the energy sector. We have 6 measures that were taken in this context. The first measure had to do with undisrupted supply of materials and spare parts. With an act of legislative content, in derogation of the closure measures of the shops, companies operating in the production, transport and transmission, supply and distribution of liquefied fuels or gas, electricity and natural gas, so this means all the energy actors actually, may procure materials and spare parts from these closed companies and commercial stores, as long as these were essential for the uninterrupted operation of critical infrastructure and necessary equipment. Evaluating this measure, one understands that it had a key role in the undisrupted operation of those energy companies, and it was essential to address any security of supply concerns. Turning to the second measure, this has to do with the mandatory implementation of long-distance transactions. Approximately 50% of the bills in Greece are paid at the regular physical point of service. So the legislative act obliged the suppliers of electricity and natural gas to provide consumers with the possibility of using mobile applications, the internet, or other means, example, the telephone, to do all the transactions with them, even switching between suppliers. Evaluating this measure, given the restrictions of movement, like all countries, and the closure of most customer service points, this measure ensured that the bills were paid in time, securing the liquidity for the suppliers on the one hand, and this had also a benefit to the consumers, given that their health was protected, but they had also access to the full range of services. Turning to the third measure, specific to the energy sector, it had to do, like in Portugal, with various extensions, but this time only for renewable projects. Such extensions aimed at supporting the viability of the investments in this field. Most notably, there was an extension of the duration of installation licenses, final grid connection offers expiring within this year. There was an extension of deadlines for the submission of the letter of guarantee to receive this connection agreement. And finally, there was a retention of reference prices, whether these were obtained through participation in the renewable tenders or by law. This retention had a duration of extra 4 months. Evaluating this measure, one comes to understand that due to the delays, example, imagine a company having to procure photovoltaics from China. This would affect the timely implementation of the projects. These deadline extensions helped protect the investments and help Greece to proceed with its ambitious national plan for high renewables penetration, because under the recently adopted National Energy and Climate Plan, the goal for Greece is to go from 19.7 to 35% by 2030. So we have the decommissioning of the traditional lignite plants, just as in Spain and other countries. To understand the exact importance of the extensions, I have here a schematic for you showing the 5 steps for the licensing of renewables. So we have the production license, the environmental license, then the final connection offer, the installation license, and finally the operation license. The first 2 have a long duration and there was no need to extend them. But in all other cases, we see an extension from 2 to 6 months. And finally, regarding the reference prices, which have to do with the operation, a period of 4 months. Going to the next energy-specific measure, I have to describe for a second the role of the Center of Renewable Energy Sources and Saving. This is the national entity for the promotion of renewable energy sources, rational use of energy, and energy conservation. It also acts as an official consultant of the Greek state. The problem here is that the tenure of the board of directors expired during COVID, and the regular procedure could not be followed. So what was chosen was to extend by law, by an act of legislative content actually, the duration of the tenure of the existing board of directors. This had 2 positive effects. It ensured the undisrupted operation of the center, which would still act as a consultant to the Greek state. And also, it allowed the board to take measures for the safety of the employees of the center, which could be then these measures duly decided and implemented during the COVID outbreak. Turning to the 5th measure specific to the energy sector, there was, through again an act of legislative content, the possibility to settle payments due by electricity or gas suppliers regarding the regulated charges. So the system works as follows. Electricity and natural gas suppliers may settle part of their due payments relating to regulated charges, which are payable to the TSOs and DSOs for a specific period, almost 1.5 months, until 31st of May. It worked by giving 70% in advance when the payment was due, paying also the VAT for the whole amount, and then the remaining 30% could be settled on 4 equal monthly installments. The sole requirement for this to apply was to notify the competent TSO or DSO and the regulatory authority. Evaluating this measure, suppliers collect regulated charges to the energy bills. As I already explained, more than 50% of the energy bills, they are paid in physical service points. So delays in payments were anticipated. By having this settlement process, all the delay concerns were effectively addressed. Turning to the final measure, this was a mandatory short-term special purpose loan for the renewables market operator, Raphael. Again, with an act of legislative content, the renewables operator, Raphael, who is also responsible for issuing guarantees of origin, would receive this short-term special purpose loan for the purpose of enhancing the liquidity of the renewables account. Again, due to delayed payments, liquidity issues did arise with the special account because the VAPED could not collect in time the special RES levy on pollutant emissions. This is one of the main cash inflows of the renewables account. And this, the PEP after has to pay the renewables producers, and they would have a problem with the sustainability also of their business. Putting this into a scheme to understand, we see the main cash inflows of the account. Here in the middle is the special levy for renewables. After all this money is collected from the PEP, all the renewables producers are paid. By injecting a loan to the special account, we ensure liquidity and viability of the renewable projects. Finally, trying to draw some conclusions, we can say that all the measures taken played a key role to the overall situation of the Greek energy sector. The measures were timely, the Greek government acted immediately. They were also appropriate and proportionate because they had a limited duration. They were very focused in solving the existing problems. And they also came through the constant discussion, the regular and very intensive dialogue that the Ministry of Environment and Energy had established with all energy stakeholders. Finally, the measures can be said to have been efficient since they sufficiently address the important concerns on health protection, liquidity, regular operation and security of supply, as well as investment and business sustainability. As a final thought, I would like to say, what are the prospects for Greece after implementing all these measures? The implemented measures allow room for confidence that Greece has created the necessary permanent means to address any future negative impact in case there is a second or a third wave of the pandemic. The adaptiveness demonstrated towards the dynamic situation, along with the country's good track record with COVID, are the key takeaways from this experience. Thank you very much for your attention and patience.
Thank you very much, Panos. So we have time for one very quick question. So one of the questions that has come in is about the energy transition, and I think it relates back to what a few of the earlier speakers stated in talking about vulnerable customers. And so the question relates to how do we ensure that this transition is a just transition? So if I could have a very quick answer from one of the Portuguese speakers, either Ivone or Vanda, and then go to Nicole and then Panos. So who wants to answer it there first? Vanda?
Yes. Well, first of all, I will just make a remark because I think it's better the presentation made by Ivone. I think there was a concern, as Ivone said, to do a just transition, and the Portuguese government is looking very closely at the Green Deal and implementing the Green Deal. So I let Ivone detail, since I believe it's more focused on our presentation.
As I've explained, there are a chapter on the economic recovery plan in order to promote energy efficiency and also the decentralized production among the more vulnerable consumers. And there is a plan with financial support in order to promote this kind of project and in order to make an inclusive energy transition, making sure that the renewable could be used also by the most vulnerable customers. Mainly, the municipalities will have public support in order to develop certain kinds of energy communities.
Thank you.
In a similar way, this is one of the parts of the recovery program post-COVID.
Thank you. And we seem to have lost Nicole, so straight to you, Panos.
Thank you, Raphael. So regarding the just transition, I think that on the one hand, the price of the renewables, which will be declining, there will be a benefit for the consumer. But at the same time, ensuring that the appropriate funds from Europe and from Greece are addressed to the areas most affected, for example, by the closure of lignite mines and lignite production plants. This is the way to proceed and assure that the Green Deal is also a fair deal.
Thank you. And would Peter Cameron or Branislava like to have a quick final word, or you're happy? Did you want to say anything in respect of the UK, Peter, or you're good? We didn't have your audio.
No, but one very small point maybe on renewable energy. One of the problems that has been flagged up is in the supply chain. That although people have been saying that the crisis may have been good for renewable energy, some countries that produce components that are necessary for equipment for wind and solar energy may have difficulty in supplying some of these components. So that however positive you may be about it in, say, Spain or Italy or UK, you might find that some of the key components are not readily available. That's something that's been flagged up as a potential problem for the UK's renewable energy sector.
Thank you. So I think on that note, we will conclude this morning's session. And I'd like to invite you all back to the later session in the afternoon. I think we can say thank you to all the speakers, Branislava, Peter, Ivone, Vanda, Panos and Nicole, and Indigo. And it's good to hear from a range of voices around Europe. And hopefully, as Vicente said at the start, we can grow the association further and hear more of the beautiful accents that us Europeans have. So on that note, I welcome you back to hear from 7 other speakers, 7 other voices of energy law in the afternoon. So do join us and hear from us all again in the afternoon. So thank you very much, everyone, and see you later today.